Well, good afternoon. Welcome. I see some people are still coming in. My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the Associate Director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. It is my pleasure to introduce the 15th iteration of the Charlemos event. We recently had our first year anniversary at the end of June. A very successful series, which we are so pleased that it continues with the current event for today, Changes in Black Politics in Latin America. We have with us Kwame Dixon and David De Micheli, with Alisha Holland facilitating today's event. Alisha, please take it away.
Terrific. Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. My name is Alisha Holland, and I'm an associate professor of government at Harvard University, and I'm one of the new members of the Charlemos team. For those of you who don't know, Charlemos is a joint initiative between LASA's Political Institutions section and the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And the basic format is we try to focus on recently published papers, usually on pretty contemporary subjects, and make the research accessible through a conversational format. And we're really grateful to the staff at CLAS for making this event possible, especially during this summer session. So today we're here to think about changes in Black politics with two wonderful guests. So we'll be speaking with Kwame Dixon, an associate professor at Howard University, and he's the author of numerous books and articles on comparative racial politics. But today we'll be focusing on his 2020 article, Afro-Latin Social Movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, which was published in Politics. And we'll also be in conversation with David De Micheli, an assistant professor of political science and ethnic studies at the University of Utah. And we'll be focusing in on his recent article in World Politics, Racial Reclassification and Political Identity Formation. And we pick these authors and articles in part because they begin with the question of how identities and Black consciousness are changing in the region, which should allow us to then expand into broader themes around how political engagements, protests, and mobilization also have evolved. So with that, let me start us off with a question for David. So David, in your article, you highlight this amazing fact, which is that between the 2000 and 2010 censuses in Brazil, Brazil's population went from majority white to minority white. And you suggest that Brazilians who long thought of themselves as mixed race or tried to classify themselves towards whiteness, now increasingly classify themselves towards Blackness. So can you tell us what's behind this shift?
I can. Thank you. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. I'm really grateful to participate in Charlemos and to be speaking to you all today. So yeah, this sort of empirical pattern that's been unfolding in Brazil over the past two-ish decades now is really kind of at the center of my current research and this article I published earlier this year. And there are a couple of sort of knee-jerk reactions that I think really come to mind for a lot of folks. One of them is that, affirmative action, a lot of them revolve around affirmative action, either as a kind of sort of watershed institutional change that created incentives for individuals to kind of identify as Black all of a sudden, or kind of in a more symbolic vein that it kind of has provided a kind of a more welcoming or a more inclusive is more inclusive towards Blackness, that has kind of encouraged identification sort of in that vein. And I think that there's something to both of these arguments, but what I actually argue in my research is that these recent patterns, in particular, kind of this reversal of this kind of status quo that has really emphasized kind of race mixture and kind of reclassification towards whiteness when possible, this phenomenon of whitening. What I argue is really behind this is educational expansion for the lower classes in Brazil in recent years. Processes of state-led educational expansion that really began in the 1990s under sort of following redemocratization, and in particular under Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and then that really picked up and took off under Workers' Party's governments in in the 2000s and the 2010s. And so what I sort of describe in my research is kind of this unprecedented access to high school and university education that has been opened up, in particular for lower class Brazilians. These are folks who, traditionally in the status quo, are darker skinned on average, right? We know from a lot of sociological studies that skin tone is a really strong correlate of income and a whole host of other social outcomes like education, but also sort of health. But we also know from some ethnographic research that lower class Brazilians have also sort of been socialized to kind of internalize racial hierarchies. Kind of one of the big paradoxes of the Brazilian case, but also other cases in Latin America, is that what we tend to see is that there's some degree of participation in the reproduction of racial hierarchies among those who are ostensibly the racially dominated, right? So it's not just it's not necessarily the type of racial consciousness that we've come to recognize in the United States or say South Africa, right? These two canonical cases in sort of the study of racial politics. And so the kind of the paradox in Brazil has always been kind of how we sort of get over that hurdle and how to sort of get individuals who might meet the criteria of Blackness in kind of common sense terms to kind of embrace and sort of accept those categories so that they can contest the kinds of inequalities or hierarchies that affect their day-to-day lives. And so what I sort of argue has happened in recent years in Brazil is that, educational expansion, partly through race-targeted policies like affirmative action, but I would argue more importantly through a general kind of prioritizing and funding of public education in Brazil more broadly, has really incorporated lower class Brazilians through education and has really, through experiences of upward mobility, increased their exposure to a whole host of racial hierarchies and inequalities that have really shaped their personal experiences and their personal perspectives, and importantly, their sort of racial subjectivities, right? So it's sort of through the experiences of upward mobility that have come with educational expansion that I argue, have really brought individuals face to face with kind of these sort of racial barriers that, have long been evident in the data, but that maybe haven't been so personal or so apparent to these folks. And so drawing on these kinds of new personal experiences that they've had, they've kind of come to embrace Blackness and kind of understand their personal experiences and their relative social positions sort of in racial terms. So I've done my best to kind of give you the elevator version of that, but I can, I'm sure we'll sort of talk a little bit more about sort of what else is going on there, but I'll leave it there for now.
That's great, David. And it's a fascinating argument that actually public education is really behind the increasing tendency to classify as Black in Brazil. I want to bring Kwame into the conversation now, who has a slightly different focus. Instead of really looking at racial classification, Kwame's article is interested in the takeoff of Afro-Latin social movements, and particularly the sort of explosive growth between the 1970s through the 2000s. So Kwame, can you tell us a little bit about what explains the growth of Black social movements in the region?
Okay, thank you very much, the University of Pitt and the Center for Latin American Studies for organizing this. Thank you, Alisha, for this. But before I say that, I would like to say I totally agree with David's position around the ways in affirmative action to reclassify racial hierarchies. My second book on Brazil, I did a section on affirmative action in Salvador. And actually, Salvador started their affirmative action programs in the 1980s. Right, but a different kind of affirmative action. So it's interesting to hear David talk about the ways in which public education has shifted how people think about racial categories. So, and you guys should have just presented him, because we could talk about that all day, right? So why social movements in the 70s? It's hard, a couple things before we talk about social movements. As my colleague at Syracuse University, before I came to Howard, I was at Syracuse University, and you may know him, John Burdick, right? And John Burdick would always remind me that most social movements fail, right? The social movements that we tend to focus on are the ones that are, quote, successful. Right? The hundreds and the thousands of other movements that may peter off usually don't get the research, or they don't get the grants or what. So I think we have to keep that in mind. B, I would like to make a distinction between old social movements and new social movements. And I think the kind of social movements we are referring to are new social movements. So we're talking about, I think just for a generic description here, not analytical, but for the sake of the conversation, the old social movements would be those groups that were trying to overthrow the state, change state power, change the trajectory of the state. Whereas new social movements generally, right, would be those groups that are attempting to pressurize the state for particular action, affirmative action, women's rights, land rights, in general, environmental rights. We can talk about old and new, that's important. So why the 70s? Or what is the context of the 70s? So you had in Colombia, Manuel Zapata in Colombia, the Afro-Colombian Folkloric Center. So in the middle of the 1970s, around 73, 74, he organized 3 to 4 conferences on Black culture, right? One in Cali, one in Panama, I think the one in Sao Paulo. So that was really the beginning. Well, not the beginning, that was a century-old process unfolding around this idea of Black culture, Black identity, Black. It wasn't, a radical statement on Black consciousness, but we began to see by the middle of the 1970s, this idea around organizing around Black culture. So it was people from Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and other countries in the region. So I think that's important. And also I think by the 1970s, we see the rise of the blocos in Brazil, Iliae 1972-73, Olodum 1976-77, and right at the sort of the end of the dictatorship, in which I argue these groups took sophisticated political messages around Blackness and consciousness and re-articulated it within a cultural framework. Alisha, to your question, why the 70s? I can't say why. I can't pinpoint the 70s per se, but we do see something happening during that time frame.
Great. It's fascinating to hear that, Black social movements really take off recognizing Black culture in the 70s. And we'll come back to that point, but I now want to kind of try to link your work together a little bit. So David, I'm curious what role you see Black social movements playing in the shift towards Black identification, and maybe even thinking more specifically about their role within public universities. Are students connecting to Black groups? Is that part of the story of this identity shift? Or do you think it's working through other channels?
I absolutely, on your second point, right? I definitely think that part of a huge, one of the things I lay out in this article, but also in my research more broadly, is that, social movements and social networks more generally are kind of one of the main pathways that I think education is really operating to shape kind of these experiences, but also these shifting patterns of racial identification in Brazil. But I would say, in general, Black social movements and social movements in general kind of have direct and indirect kind of, there are sort of direct and indirect ways that they're kind of really important in these kinds of processes. So sort of directly, the Black movement in Brazil is kind of has for decades, as Kwame's work shows, has been one of the main voices and sort of political forces really pushing for the kind of racial change. A lot of the, sort of the major institutional changes that we've seen in Brazil. So kind of as this, tireless actor in the political arena that's really been trying to force race onto the political agenda, it certainly has been really, it's difficult to understate sort of the perseverance, perseverance of the movement, and especially, something that comes through really clearly in Tiana Pechel's work is how kind of against the odds the movement really was, right? As sort of to Kwame's point about how, most movements fail. The Black movement is not, is not your typical successful social movement in that, it's not a mass-based movement necessarily, certainly not on par with, say, the US civil rights movement. And it's not necessarily well-resourced, as you might expect for a movement that has had the impact that it's had in Brazil, sort of shaping, influencing political elites and affecting kind of national policy in the way that it's been able to. The Black movement certainly, part of what I describe is kind of the mechanisms of exposure that education brings about. So for a lot of folks, at least a lot of the folks that I've sort of spoken with in Brazil is kind of twofold. So, certainly if you are arriving to university, I think it's not going to be a surprise to anyone that universities are just, they're kind of hubs of activism, right? There are a lot of student groups on campus. There are a lot of sort of organizing, and it's sort of at a point in one's life where you maybe kind of come into your own politically and start to develop a point of view, and you are more engaged politically maybe than you were when you were younger, and you maybe start to develop kind of points of view that you kind of want to pursue yourself through activism, right? So students in general, I think, tend to just be they're more politically engaged. They participate more in all kinds of social movements. And a lot of what I heard from my interviewees were things like, some of them who sought out Black movements, right? Who maybe went to university and who started taking history classes and became really interested in Black issues. And there's a Black group on campus that they started sort of attending. Others weren't necessarily interested in the Black movement. They were interested in women's movements, right? But then they started attending feminist events, and they either encountered Black feminists there that really sort of caught their attention, or they kind of were started asking questions about the absence of racial issues, right? So that you kind of get both sides of this sort of issue, and through the engagement of social movements. But I've also spoken to a lot of folks who say something much more inadvertent, which is something like, I was hanging out with my friends from university one day and I tagged along with them to an event, and the things I heard at that event changed everything for me, right? Like I was totally caught off guard by how much what I heard there really resonated with my own experience and taught me to understand my experiences as racialized, right? That it's not necessarily, they didn't necessarily have that kind of perspective or the kind of the discourse that they needed to make sense of their experiences in that way, but that they just kind of inadvertently became exposed to that kind of lens, and that really changed things for them. So I would say that's kind of the direct way, right? That's sort of by virtue of either putting you in contact with social movements directly or changing your social networks and your contacts that can lead you maybe more indirectly into contact with certain social movements. But I also would sort of highlight that, the Black movement also has played a really important role in Brazil, in that it's not just a movement that's trying to raise racial consciousness. I mean, it is, but it's also doing a lot of other things like providing certain social services. One of the most important ones that I would argue is kind of education courses in preparation for the university entrance exam. So, Brazilian public universities are the most prestigious in the country. They're extremely well funded. And, there's sort of the classic paradox where, in order to get into these high quality public universities in Brazil, you need to have had a very high quality private primary and secondary education, right? So there's sort of universities that absorb a lot of resources that are sort of the enclave of wealth and whiteness historically in Brazil. And so students who are coming from more humble backgrounds, who are perhaps the first in their family to go to university, they don't necessarily have the same preparation to succeed in the exams, to gain slots in these public universities, which, by the way, are completely free. And so one of the things that the Black movement does is it provides, university preparation courses to study for this exam. And that was actually one of my main field sites when I was conducting my field research in Brazil. And so, there are folks who kind of started taking these classes not because they were interested in the Black movement, but because they just wanted to get into university, right? And so it's sort of kind of through those pull factors that kind of pulled them into these networks that then exposed them to a kind of worldview and a perspective that they weren't necessarily anticipating or necessarily showing up for, but that kind of swept them up nonetheless. So I think there are kind of those direct and indirect ways that social movements can sort of they're kind of part of the education story, even though we don't necessarily think of social movements as kind of education per se in a traditional sense.
That's so cool. I had no idea that Black social movements were involved in university preparation in that way. And that could be one of the channels to also expanding access and involvement in Black social movements. Kwame, so let me link you into a point that, I think David highlights really well through the use of census statistics is just the number of people who, by virtue of their skin tone, might be discriminated against and labeled as Black, yet for long periods of time didn't identify as such. And so I'm curious, from your study of Black social movements, what are social movements doing to raise Black consciousness and shape identities among those who don't yet identify as Black?
Mhm. Well, I think it's important. I use a concept that I think is important, and I refer to the concept as Afro-Civil Society. Okay, and I take the normative underpinnings of however you see civil society in Latin America, right, or in Europe or in Africa. But I look at the traditional ways we think about civil society, and I argue that the traditional conceptual underpinnings of civil society does not really capture the nuances of Blackness in Latin America. And thus, Afro-civil society, whenever from the 1960s to 1970s, began to talk about many of these issues that David, I am, and you're reading about now. Of course, affirmative action would emerge from Afro-civil society. Black people could not go to school in Salvador. So the idea that affirmative action would emerge from somewhere else, I'm not saying that it emerged exclusively from Afro-civil society. The idea of Black land rights in Colombia, Afro-civil society. The idea of radical feminist politics, Afro-civil society. So my point is that I think before the social movements per se, we have to take a look at Afro-civil society as a conceptual underpinning, because Afro-civil society talks about the modalities of Black consciousness, which can be absolutely so much texture. You're Black, you're rural, you're candomblé, you are animist, you are Santeria. It depends on where you're positioned. So the axis of Black consciousness via Afro-civil society has so many expressions, right? But some of the commoner points would be, of course, affirmative action, would of course be police violence, would of course be some of the general points we could agree on. So what I'm getting at, I think that before social movements and before the Black movements, you have Afro-civil society, and I include that in North America also. Most Black politicians in the US came out of Afro-civil society. Most Black politicians, most social movements activists in Latin America came out of Afro-civil society. But we have this idea that for some way civil society is neutral. It's not race neutral. And therefore, I think as a conceptual and theoretical idea, it helps us think about some of these movements and the rise of Black politics.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great concept to add to the ways that we talk about civil society, and a really important point. Let me jump back to David for a minute, given that we've talked or touched on these issues of affirmative action and how central they are to Afro-civil society, and also to some of the educational changes you study. The cynical interpretation of affirmative action is always, well, this is about people checking boxes. So suddenly you create this incentive for people to check that they are Black to get access to university. But there's nothing really deeper about their identity classifications. How do you separate out and disentangle whether it's something about public education itself, or sort of this instrumental approach to identity to claim benefits that explains the trend toward Blackness that you observe?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one I think about a lot, because it's probably the main explanation that I feel I'm always arguing against. It's the one, I think it is the knee-jerk response when people learn about the patterns that I'm studying. I'll just say first, it's really difficult to kind of disentangle the two, because affirmative action, the dominant form of that policy in Brazil is education, right? So even if you're using an affirmative action benefit, the idea is that you're doing it to gain greater education, right? So we have this kind of the two are related, these two sort of different variables. But that said, I sort of approach this in a number of different ways. Well, let me say first that theoretically, I think that even though it seems like a really simple and parsimonious explanation, I think it actually runs into, it's not as compelling as to me as it might be to initially to an observer. So on the one hand, a lot of the patterns that we're seeing in Brazil are patterns that are coming up in the census data, right? And this is not data that, this is anonymous data no material benefits or sort of access to any other kind of public benefit depends on what you respond to a census interviewer, right? So in that respect, right, the kind of the patterns in the census are at least one step removed from what you might be doing elsewhere. The other is that, in order to take advantage of affirmative action benefits in Brazil, certainly education benefits, in order to sort of, if you are this kind of instrumental opportunist who might be trying to pursue this strategy, really what you have to do is check a box on a form. Brazil relies on self-identification to dole out affirmative action benefits. And so, even if you are sort of pursuing this strategy, it's kind of, a pretty short-term strategy you can pursue, right? If you are really seeking to reap rewards from your racial identification, you can check the box on the form and then go about your life, probably trying to reap the rewards of whiteness, sort of in other sort of categories, right? So it doesn't really account for these kind of long-term sustained patterns of reclassification that have become very clear in the census data, and that have really continued through, in the most recent data that the Census Bureau really has collected. So in that respect, I think the kind of instrumental hypothesis, it's not as it's not as satisfying, at least to me, as it might initially seem. But nonetheless, I sort of approach this in a number of different ways. In the article that I published, I used survey experiments to try to isolate, sort of to isolate this instrumental benefit as something that survey respondents might respond to and choosing to identify. But in my other research, sort of that I'm currently doing in my book project, I take two additional empirical approaches. One relies on subnational variation between the 2000 and 2010 censuses to look at, how do these patterns kind of vary across Brazil? They're not uniform. So what's clear in the census data is that there are most states in the South and the Southeast of Brazil tends to be where we see the greatest rates of reclassification towards Blackness, right? So it's in these this sort of southern, wealthier, more developed regions of Brazil where we tend to see reclassification. And these also happen to be where education rates are higher, right? And not just higher, but where we've seen some major expansion around university education. And so what I can kind of do in my analyses is sort of use kind of that variation over time, sort of subnationally, to kind of get leverage on sort of where we're seeing, whether it's education per se, is it just where people are attending university or attending high school, or is it only in states where we see affirmative action being implemented, right? So, today, of the 27 states that there are in Brazil, I think it's something like 23 have some form of affirmative action policy today. But by 2010, there were only a handful, right? So there's some major subnational differences there that can really be leveraged to get a handle on this question. And what I essentially find in my analyses is that there's a little bit of a boost from affirmative action states, but there's not a significant boost, and there certainly isn't any qualitative difference between affirmative action states and non-affirmative action states and where we're seeing rates of reclassification, right? What matters more is whether or not access to education has actually expanded in certain localities, and sort of how that affects the tendency to sort of reclassify over time. Another approach I take in my research, which is a bit more complicated, certainly during the pandemic, because I haven't been able to go back to Brazil, is I've actually gained access to some protected data through the Ministry of Education that allows me to construct a panel of university applicants in Brazil. So I'm able to sort of identify applicants from high school survey records, their university registration application records, and then how they identify when they arrive to university. And I can sort of follow their racial identifications over time to see if there's evidence of this kind of instrumental behavior. And there is evidence that individuals, when checking the box on the form, will sort of manipulate the racial identifications, seemingly to take advantage of affirmative action benefits. But what I also find is that by the time that they get to university, they tend to revert back to how they identified previously, right? So to the extent that there is some manipulation, which does exist and is a real problem for the effectiveness of affirmative action policies, it tends to be pretty short-lived, right? So in terms of being an explanation for these kinds of sustained patterns that we see in the census data, I don't know that it's not as satisfying from my view.
Great, thanks so much, David, for clarifying that. So Kwame, you highlight that some of the main successes of Black social movements have been things like multicultural constitutions, anti-discrimination laws, and maybe we'd also put in that bucket affirmative action. But skeptics again might say, you know, these are symbolic victories. These are things that countries commit to on paper. And I'm curious from your study of, you know, Black civil society, you know, to what extent you see these legal changes as really translating into differences in the lived experience of Black communities or the strength of Black civil society.
Well, it's a balance, okay? As David is saying, like affirmative action, a version of it that I'm familiar with in Salvador came out of Salvador, Afro Civil Society in Salvador in the late 80s and the 1990s. So therefore, if we're going to think about affirmative action, and as David is saying, he's looking at it on a sub-regional level, doing cross comparison with data to find out where it's been more successful or how people have reclassified themselves. But just taking the idea in general, the idea of affirmative action, a version of it at least, came out of Afro civil society. So if we argue that civil society, affirmative action has been moderately successful, we could say affirmative action. We have to be conscious though, it can, in 5 years, it can swing back to the pendulum can swing. And David talked about in a way, we know the census, we use that term here. I know we're just using it in general, but the census has been a big battle across Black communities in the Americas. We have it now, Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, not Ecuador, but Brazil. But the fact that you have a census for so long when people were not classifying themselves, and I'm not saying it exclusively came from Black communities, but they were part of that conversation. So that's important. I think that in terms of multicultural reforms, I'll refer you to Charles Hell's article on multicultural reforms in Latin America. Basically, I'm not going to paraphrase his article, but he's very suspicious. And I think he's very suspicious of the multicultural reforms that have unfolded. But I mean, if you go from a country like Ecuador that considered itself a mestizo society for so many years to calling itself a multi-ethnic society, if you've ever been to Ecuador, that's a big deal, right? But at the same time, how does that undergird the society for Black and Indigenous peoples? If you go to Colombia, when we talk about now, Colombia is a multi-ethnic society. So of course, reform by definition is suspect, right? But the two biggest gains would definitely be land rights in Colombia, right? The census in certain countries, Argentina, Brazil, and census, land rights, and of course, affirmative action. And then you would have to nuance it, right? And go to the various countries and say, well, what about this kind of like Guatemala, Honduras in terms of Garifuna rights? But so it's a mixed bag. But I think Hell's article speaks to it the best in terms of being suspicious of those multicultural reforms.
Great. So let me ask you guys one last joint question for the two of you, and then I do want to bring the audience in to ask their own questions. And this is just building off your work, which is neither of you really discussed the role of the police and police violence directly in affecting the identification or mobilization of Black communities. But obviously from the vantage point of the US, it's on a lot of people's mind with BLM. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see inequalities in the treatment of the police affecting Black identification and Black civil society in Latin America? David, why don't I start with you?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. And you're right, it's not something I devote a lot of specific attention to in this article and really more broadly in my research. I do kind of, a question I sometimes get when I'm presenting my research is, especially if I'm presenting in front of a more American audience is, are you really telling me that, these folks who are kind of, I think of them as kind of status quo compliers, right? These folks who have sort of internalized racial hierarchies. Are you really telling me that they don't realize that they're being, targeted by the police or that they're being terrorized by the police and these sorts of things? And it's a question that I sometimes as an American researcher, you go to these contexts where you feel like the inequalities are so evident in front of you, but there's so much ambiguity around them sort of on the ground. And so, I think the question is, it's not that these folks don't understand their experiences, right? Or they don't know what they've been through, or they don't know that there's violence and crime and sort of say abuses by the police in their communities. The question is often just in what terms they're making sense of those experiences, right? And I think as so many researchers have written about kind of racial politics in Brazil, there is a kind of a nationalist discourse that kind of disarticulates that kind of racial perspective. And then there's also just this common sense that, social class is this really important fundamental basis for making sense of inequalities. And so that tends to be this, especially if you encounter folks who don't have connections to social movements or, or activism and things of that, who aren't necessarily, haven't had a lot of formal education, I think you tend to get these kinds of common sense narratives about, the importance of social class. But, this is kind of one of these things that comes up with interviewees with reclassifiers where they say, they'll often think back to their experiences with their police, and reinterpret them, right? They'll come to understand them in racial terms, even though at the time they maybe didn't, right? This is something I heard a lot from university students that I had interviewed, especially university students who were admitted via affirmative action. A lot of what they, almost all of them had some story about, being out with their friends in public, in a public square at night, and then having some encounter with the police where, they felt like they were treated differently from their friends, right? Like they were hanging out with a group of friends and they were all doing the same thing, but only some of them got arrested, right? And at the time they just thought it was unfair and they didn't understand, but over time they came to understand that as a racial sort of issue. So I think it's something that, to kind of summarize, it's not something that, to me, it's part of this bundle of experiences that ultimately over time might contribute to changing racial identifications, but it's not entirely clear to me that it in and of itself will lead to a kind of racial consciousness, if that makes sense. But I would be curious to hear if Kwame agrees with that.
Okay, thank you. Well, so I'll speak. So my research was in Salvador, right? So I know Rio a little bit. I know Sao Paulo very little. So my perspective is Salvador. Of course, state-sponsored violence, state-sponsored, state-led violence against Afro peoples is the issue in Salvador. I can't say about Minas Gerais. It is the issue. It will continue to be the issue. And while I was doing my research, my second book on which is on Brazil, is called Afro-Politics and Civil Society in Salvador de Bahia. So I'm looking at the rise of Black politics and civil society from the 1970s until like 2016. However, as you probably know, David, as Alisha, everyone that's on this call, you've done research. And while in Salvador, the issue of police violence just kept obviously unfolding and unfolding. And I had to choose and pick, when you're doing research, how to stay focused. Because once you get 2 to 3 chapters into a book, obviously you can bring in police violence. But I felt that if I went there, that it would be a whole nother book, technically, right? So it is real. So, but I would say probably there are many, but one of the best books, one of the most best comprehensive statements on violence against Afro peoples in the hemisphere, but focused on Sao Paulo, is Jaime Alves' book, Sao Paulo, the Anti-Black City, Race and Police Terror in Brazil. It is very comprehensive, is numerically and analytically rich, and he lays out the ways in which the carceral state, neoliberal politics, and other forms of violence just decimates the Afro population of Sao Paulo. And what's good about that book is that you can look at, it could be Chicago, it could be Santo Domingo and the República Dominicana, it could be the Black communities on the Pacific coast of Colombia, right? So, I mean, I think that is the issue, one of the issues. Land rights, of course, police, state-led state-sponsored violence, and so many more. So you really have to have your research together, because it's not, as we say, Brazil is not for beginners. So if you're gonna go into the violence, you really have to understand the forces and the state and the ways, and in Salvador, one more point before I close, Salvador is mainly Black. So of course, for the past century, most of the police have been Black and or mulatto, if you use that term. So you've had some nasty racial politics, right, in Salvador. Then you have to look at the federal police, then you have to look at the Policía Militar in terms of their politics. So it's a nasty racial logic. And I would just recommend Alvis's book for a statement on police violence in Brazil.
Great recommendation. So I want to open it up to the audience if you have any questions.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. This is so informative, and I don't study Brazil as one of the cases of that I know super well. So this is super, super interesting. I guess what I have read, and I guess this is a little bit more for David, but I think both of you, I would love to hear from both of you, is sort of this idea. I'm thinking of Michael Hanchard and sort of the idea of racial democracy as hegemonic to the point of sort of, you know, having people buy into, and David, you were talking a little bit about this, but that racial democracy has become so hegemonic, or had become so hegemonic, that there was sort of a blinding of self-interest against people's self-interest. And I wonder, especially since you're saying that this really has to do with education, whether the sort of there's been some kind of dismantling of the idea of racial democracy. And of course, I'm thinking about the debate over education about racism in the US, which I'm not sure if that's such a debate, but right, this sort of manufactured debate about our education on race and racism in the US, whether the dismantling of the idea or the myth of racial democracy has been part of the curriculum, and if that's part of the mechanism you're seeing. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and I think I would say that there is, Michael Hanchard, I think he really set the tone for so much of what has come after him, and sort of especially in the study of social movements in Brazil. When I was doing my field research, I was kind of struck by how right and wrong I found his argument, right? There are folks you speak to and you're like, yep, this is exactly what Michael Hanchard said, right? But there are also folks where you're like, this is exactly what John Burdick said, right? Where, the struggles of the Black movement aren't quite this kind of nationalist discourse. It's their failure to kind of connect with these other issues, right? Or, people are more complicated than the Black movement kind of allows for in their kind of worldview. But then there are folks that are really politicized, who kind of do have this racial consciousness and have, kind of are really adept at, disarticulating that kind of racial democracy narrative. And so I guess my answer is that, I guess what I would say broadly is that, the patterns that we're seeing are supplementing but not supplanting the status quo, right? It's not like there's no whitening anymore, right? And it's not like there aren't people who don't continue to talk about, the three races and that we're all racially united and therefore the same, right? That there's only one Brazilian race, like this kind of language. You still encounter that, but I think you also encounter a lot more language around racial difference, a lot more language around recognizing racial inequalities and the need to kind of combat them and just their reality. I think what we're kind of starting to see, the way I think about the patterns that I study, but also then just kind of sort of the context of racial politics in Brazil more broadly, is that, we're just kind of seeing the scale tip a little bit in the other direction. I think you don't have to look any farther than, the past 5 years in electoral politics of Brazil to realize that there's been a real backlash against this too, right? So it's not that, we've just seen, it's not like education is not a panacea kind of washing away the kind of the past and this sort of circumstance. It's done a lot to, one of the main things I think, one of the things I read about in the article is kind of education as a mechanism of exposure, that what part of what it exposes people to is information. And that might seem really obvious, but it's like a really specific kind of information that you maybe took for granted. Like, what is Brazil and what does it mean to be Brazilian? And where did that idea even come from? And what were the effects of that idea, right? Why was that idea even put in place? Right, so all of these kinds of taken for granted common sense truths, you kind of learn more about the history about them. And for some folks, especially folks who study in the humanities or in the social sciences, that's really impactful on them and sort of how they think about themselves and how they think about inequality more generally, right? So I think that's kind of like where I see education kind of fitting into that story. But it's also a bit more complicated because there are also folks who go to, they're like really traditional middle class or elite folks who go to university and who study medicine, right? And engineering, right? Who have absolutely no exposure to those kinds of things. And they can also get sort of hardened into certain positions that are kind of, that might be more conservative, right? And sort of anti-racist. So yeah, I think that was sort of a roundabout way of sort of getting at this, right? Like, I think it's just, the picture has been, that we're seeing a growth in the kind of this alternative discourse, this new movement away from the kind of discourse of colorism. But it's hasn't fully supplanted the kind of the colorist logic that has always been there.
Just really quick on, I think David has been very diplomatic. So Hancher's book he said what was right about it and what was wrong about it, and he's so right. I think the Gramscian approach works for that book. For 146 pages, he squeezes a lot into that book. However, I think that we have to also think about, after the question about there being no national social movements in Brazil, perhaps is a misnomer, because when we look at Salvador, why do we need national movements in a country as large as Brazil? So there were social movements, Black social movements in Salvador, in Minas Gerais, in other parts of Brazil at the time. So I think I love the Gramscian approach, but there were other kinds of social movements, and it would be Keil Caldwell who comes back in the late 80s or the 90s to talk about, Black women's social movements, which are not mentioned at all in Hancher's book. And then Kia Concha-Perry, who will come later in the 2000s and look at Black female women's social movements in Salvador. So I'm not saying Hancher had to include all of that. What we're saying is that there were movements as early as the 1950s and the 1960s in Salvador. Yes, they were under a dictatorship, but there were movements. So I think we have to nuance that approach by being very careful about saying there were no movements. Okay? And I love the book.
Terrific clarifications. So I have two more hands up. Why don't we take these two questions and I'll give David and Kwame a chance to respond to them. So let me start with Mateo.
Thank you, everyone. This has been super interesting. I just have a question about sort of like the coordination problems behind the things that you talk, either getting access to education or the existence of the social movements itself. And because you seem to have an underlying assumption that just because being Black, there's some sort of coordination, or it's easy to coordinate between the individuals that are working, are either going into higher education or making part of these social movements. But just like looking, for example, at the Colombian case, where you have a very distinct division between the Black population, between those who live in the Pacific area and those who live in more urban and developed areas. And that's something that the Colombian Black movement hasn't been able to actually go and overcome. And that's why you have a very, very messy sort of like political Black movement in Colombia. And I'm just thinking if the things that you're looking have something to do more with elite-driven strategies or some sort of agent that is coordinating for both of these things to happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Mateo. Let me get Juan Suarez Antonella in, and then we'll let our panelists respond.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I had a question for Professor Dixon. I was very curious about your concept of Afro-civil society. And I was just curious, as you were thinking, if you could elaborate more about this concept. I was thinking, of course, about the work that has been done recently about the Black public sphere, and specifically in Brazil about Celso Castillo's work in Pernambuco, of course, 19th century. But I was thinking if you see the two concepts in dialogue, because I think it would be very useful to think, as you said, these modalities of Blackness. And as you were thinking and referencing, I'm from Ecuador, but I was thinking those modalities are very clear just by looking at a very small country like Ecuador. If you analyze Esmeraldas and El Valle del Chota, these modalities are drastically different. So I was just curious if you could elaborate on your concept. Thank you.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, let's flip the order. Kwame, why don't you start? And then if David wants to chime in, give him a chance.
So thank you for the question, Juan. So I wrote my PhD dissertation on Afro-Ecuadorians and the struggle for human rights. So I spent time in Esmeraldas and Chota and the various communities there, sort of to provide a framework for understanding of what was happening just in Ecuador. I couldn't make cross-country comparisons. So that's where much of my work began. With respect to this idea of Afro-civil society, and also spent time on the Pacific and the Pacific and the Caribbean coast of Colombia. And just to highlight Mateo's point, so Mateo, what we're doing here, at least I am, we're talking about Black movements in general, right? So Black movements are texturally rich, divergent, different, disorganized, organized, urban, rural, candomblé, religion, they come in so many different platforms, right? So we're just talking, I think, David, it's also just Black movements in general. And oftentimes, when we talk about the divisions in, quote, the Black movements or the various Black movements, what we're talking about is really the platforms in which their identity structures emerge from. So if I'm rural and you're urban, of course, we're going to have differences, right? So I just want to say that in terms of Afro-civil society, and I forget the work you mentioned, Juan, I think those works are parallel, right? And I think Jaime Alves talks about the Black public sphere, right? And what I see with respect to Afro-civil society, my point is that before we talk about Black politics, before we talk about Black identity, before we talk about Black consciousness, we have to think about Afro-civil society in a different structured way. Because if we just start with Black social movements in Colombia on the Pacific coast in the 1980s and not go back to the 1970s, we're missing something really important about how these movements would emerge. So yes, and the Black public sphere, we can talk about that all day, but I do think Afro-civil society is a conceptual underpinning, because if you're gonna look at Black civil society in Chota, and you're going to look at Black civil society in Esmeraldas, it's going to be absolutely different, right? But the concept as a theoretical notion helps us understand why the people of Chota are in the conditions in their in versus the people of Esmeraldas versus the peoples in Guayaquil. So I just think it's a helpful way to structure Black politics, think about Black politics. We can talk about that later, but that's my beginning conceptions of that. Thank you.
Fantastic. David, do you want to add on anything?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, it sounded like your question was a bit more oriented toward the Colombian case, which is not my area of expertise, but, I think you bring up a good point, right? Which is, and then this is kind of something that, it's inherent to social movements, right? The need to kind of, there's the collective action problem, the need to mobilize people, et cetera, get them engaged in the movement is always a challenge for any social movement, and Black movements are no exception there. But what I would say is kind of like why I think education is kind of doing a lot of work here is partly because, there's a lot of demand for education. There's, people tend to see education as, first of all, public education as kind of lacking in Brazil historically, certainly at the primary and secondary levels, right? So the investments in public education that really came about starting in the 1990s and throughout into the 2000s until the Temer government, were really welcome. And there was a lot of demand for, it's seen as a pathway of upward mobility, right? And so in a country like Brazil, it's so unequal, right? That was a sort of a really welcome change. And, especially with university admissions being so competitive, sort of just the pursuit of education itself was a really impetus kind of for folks who are really motivated and ambitious, right, and hoping to improve the quality of their lives, right? And it sort of then has these kind of inadvertent, unintended effects, right? Education is like the most bundled treatment there probably is, right? It's something you pursue for years, and it's a whole host of things, right? It's not just what you do in the classroom, right? So I think that's kind of how I see it kind of overcoming some of these things, right? Is that, it allows for that micro level heterogeneity to take place, but it's also kind of this kind of top-down push that sort of, puts people onto a new path, right? That kind of exposes them to a whole host of new experiences.
Fantastic. Well, we're at time. So mainly I want to thank David and Kwame for joining us today for this fantastic discussion. And also I just want to put in a plug for both of their research papers that we discussed today, as well as their broader research agendas. David's article is just really carefully done empirically, and I think just highlights something that we haven't studied enough, which is really the politics around identification and racial classification. And we didn't even get into the questions that it then opens up about how parties are mobilizing people, how protests are potentially shifting and using Black identities in different ways. So definitely take a read. And likewise, Kwame, his research has just such a broad scope to really think about the history of some of these social movements that many of us don't know enough about, and really giving us a sense of the range of types of movements and goals, and a kind of regional perspective that's really rich, as well as some of his earlier work focusing in on Salvador. So take a look. And thank you to both of you for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alisha.
And thank you again to everybody who came today to hear this important discussion.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Okay.